In 1967, a little girl named Lisa Trevor walked into the Spencer mansion holding her mother's hand. She was 11 years old. She was there to celebrate her father's greatest architectural achievement. By the end of that night, Umbrella had taken everything from her. Her father was sealed in the mansion's walls and left to starve. Her mother was infected, studied, and discarded like waste. And Lisa, 11-year-old Lisa, was dragged to the laboratories beneath the mansion, where she would spend the next 30 years as Umbrella's most resilient, most tortured, and most tragic test subject. They injected her with every virus they had, every parasite, every experimental strain. Her body refused to die. It absorbed everything, mutated, twisted, became something that shouldn't exist. She lost her ability to speak. She lost her memories. She lost her face. But she never lost one thing: the need to find her mother. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the complete story of Lisa Trevor, from that first night in 1967 to her final devastating encounter. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about what Umbrella does to children, and about a little girl who never stopped wanting to go home. This is the sad story of Lisa Trevor, the girl who only wanted her mother. George Trevor was a world-renowned architect based in New York, a man whose mind functioned like a clockwork masterpiece. He was celebrated for his ability to weave intricate puzzles and impossible spatial logic into his structural designs, making him a legend in the world of high-end construction. To George, architecture was not merely about aesthetic beauty or structural integrity. It was an intellectual challenge. He believed that a building should tell a story and keep secrets, a philosophy that made his work unique and highly sought after by the most powerful individuals in the world. It was this specific reputation that caught the attention of Oswald E. Spencer, the billionaire aristocrat who would eventually found the Umbrella Corporation. Spencer needed someone capable of building more than just a home. He required a high-security fortress that could double as a clandestine laboratory. He commissioned George Trevor to design the Arklay Mansion, because he knew George was the only man capable of creating a structure that could mask its dark purpose through complex mechanisms. Spencer needed the architect of dreams to build what would eventually become a landscape of nightmares. For George, the commission was the opportunity of a lifetime. He viewed the project as his magnum opus, a chance to push the boundaries of his craft to their absolute limit. He spent years obsessing over the blueprints, ensuring that every secret passage, hidden room, and mechanical trap was perfectly integrated into the Victorian aesthetic. He saw Spencer as a visionary patron who appreciated the depth of his genius, never suspecting that the man was actually a predator looking for a cage. George poured his soul into the wood and stone of the mansion, unwittingly crafting the instrument of his own family's destruction. The relationship between the architect and the patron was one of mutual respect on the surface, but it was built on a foundation of cold calculation from Spencer's side. While George discussed the elegance of a hidden latch or the biometric potential of a shield key, Spencer was thinking about containment and the suppression of evidence. Spencer knew that a man who understood the mansion's secrets as well as George did could never be allowed to remain a free man. George, however, was blinded by his own ambition, seeing the Arklay project as the crowning achievement that would secure his family's future. In the final months of construction, George worked tirelessly to ensure that the mansion was a masterpiece of Victorian design. He was proud of the way the puzzles served as both security measures and psychological stress tests. He imagined his wife and daughter exploring the grand halls and marveling at the mechanical wonders he had created for them. To George Trevor, the mansion was a gift to his family and a monument to his career. He could not have known that every door he designed would eventually lock against him, and every secret he buried would become a part of a 30-year tragedy. Completed in November 1967, the Arklay Mansion was a marvel of engineering, situated deep within the forest of the Arklay Mountains. On the surface, it appeared to be a grand residence for an aristocrat, filled with priceless art and ornate furniture. However, this Victorian mask hid a much darker purpose. Beneath the floorboards and behind the wallpaper lay the beginnings of a biological research empire. The mansion was the first true laboratory for Spencer's ambitions, a place where the rules of nature could be rewritten in the dark. Spencer intended the layout of the mansion to be a testing ground for anyone who entered. The various puzzles, such as the shield key and the armor key, were not just eccentric design choices. They were biometric security measures and psychological stress tests. Anyone not authorized to be in the facility would find themselves trapped in a labyrinth of shifting walls and lethal traps. Spencer wanted the house itself to act as a containment unit, ensuring that if a viral leak ever occurred, the structure would prevent the spread of information and biological material by confusing and killing the survivors. The impossible architecture George Trevor had designed served Spencer's needs perfectly. The mansion was a place where logic failed and the environment was hostile to human intuition. It was a space designed to exert control over the inhabitants, making them feel small and vulnerable. Every hallway was a potential corridor of death, and every room was a cell waiting to be sealed. The mansion represented the original sin of the Spencer legacy, a physical manifestation of the idea that human lives were secondary to the pursuit of power and biological evolution. For the researchers who would eventually work there, the mansion was a place of high pressure and absolute secrecy. They moved through the hidden passages to reach the laboratories, always aware that the house was watching them. The design encouraged a sense of paranoia and isolation, which Spencer believed was necessary for the kind of work being conducted. The beauty of the grand dining room and the library was a thin veneer over a world of stainless steel and glass vials. It was a house built on lies, where the very air was heavy with the weight of things that should not exist. The mansion project was the blueprint for everything Umbrella would become. It established the company's methodology of hiding monstrosity behind a respectable facade. George Trevor had built a masterpiece of Victorian design, but Spencer had filled it with the shadows of the future. The house was ready to receive its first guests, and the traps were set to be sprung. It was a place where the celebration of completion was merely the signal for the beginning of an era of horror that would last for 3 decades. On November 10th, 1967, George Trevor's wife Jessica and their daughter Lisa arrived at the Arklay Mansion. Lisa was only 11 years old, a child who viewed the trip as a grand adventure to see her father's greatest work. They arrived ahead of George, expecting to celebrate the completion of the mansion with a dinner hosted by Lord Spencer. They were greeted with the cold, silent grandeur of the forest and the imposing silhouette of the house. To Lisa, the mansion looked like a castle from a fairy tale, unaware that it was actually a tomb. The celebration that was promised never occurred. As soon as Jessica and Lisa stepped through the heavy oak doors, the hospitality of the mansion evaporated. They were not treated as guests of a billionaire, but as valuable biological assets. Upon their arrival, they were immediately seized by Spencer's security men and separated. The transition from luxury to captivity was instantaneous and brutal. They were taken to the underground facilities, stripped of their identities, and prepared for the experiments that would define the rest of their lives. Jessica and Lisa were the first human subjects for the newly discovered progenitor virus. Spencer had decided that the family of the architect would provide the perfect test group for the initial trials. Because they were essentially off the grid at the remote estate, their disappearance would be easy to manage. Lisa, a young girl who should have been in school or playing in a park, was suddenly thrust into a world of clinical white lights and sterile needles. She cried out for her mother and father, but the only response was the sound of the mansion's heavy locks clicking into place. The psychological impact of the arrival was devastating. Jessica tried to protect her daughter, but she was powerless against the armed men who served Spencer. They were moved through the very secret passages George had designed, a cruel irony that added to the horror of their situation. The dream house George had built for them had become their prison before they could even spend a single night in a real bed. The celebration was a cold, calculated trap, and the Trevor family was the first price paid for the evolution of the Umbrella Corporation. This moment marked the end of Lisa Trevor's childhood. One moment, she was an 11-year-old girl with a bright future, and the next, she was subject number 2. Her fear was managed with chemical sedatives, and her screams were silenced by the soundproof walls of the laboratory. Spencer watched from his cameras, viewing the mother and daughter as data points rather than human beings. The invitation to the mansion was a death sentence, and the tragedy of the Trevor family had officially begun in the dark beneath the Arklay forest. Spencer believed that for the mansion's secrets to remain absolute, the man who built it had to be eliminated. Spencer's betrayal of George Trevor was not just a matter of convenience. It was a fundamental part of his security strategy. He could not risk the architect revealing the hidden passages, the biometric locks, or the secret laboratory entrances to the public or the authorities. To Spencer, George was a loose end that needed to be tied off with cold, surgical precision. The loyalty George felt toward his patron was met with a calculated plan for his total disappearance. The betrayal was multifaceted. Spencer had lured the entire family to the mansion under the guise of hospitality to ensure that no one would be left to ask questions or report them missing. By bringing Jessica and Lisa there first, he created a lever he could use against George if the architect became suspicious. It was a plan designed to ensure that the entire Trevor bloodline was consumed by the project. Spencer viewed the family as collateral damage in the pursuit of his godhood, a perspective that allowed him to watch their suffering without a shred of remorse. When George Trevor finally arrived at the mansion days later, he was met with lies and evasion. He was told that his wife and daughter had fallen ill and were being treated in a private wing of the estate. Spencer played the role of the concerned benefactor, manipulating George's emotions to keep him compliant, while the first viral trials were being conducted on his family. George, desperate to see his wife and daughter, was eventually led into a trap and imprisoned in the very facility he had helped design. The architect was now a prisoner of his own genius. Spencer's betrayal was a total erasure of the Trevor family from history. He utilized his vast wealth and influence to ensure that there were no records of their travel to the Arklay Mountains. He effectively turned the mansion into a black site where he could conduct his experiments without fear of interference. George Trevor, the man who had given Spencer the physical tools to hide his crimes, was the first victim of the corporate secrecy that would eventually define Umbrella. The betrayal was absolute, leaving George to rot in the foundations of his own masterpiece. The coldness of this act cannot be overstated. Spencer did not just kill the Trevors, he consumed them. He used the mother and daughter for research, and the father for sport, watching as the architect tried to navigate the labyrinth he had built. It was a game to Spencer, a way to test the effectiveness of the mansion's security before the real work began. The betrayal was the cornerstone of the Umbrella Corporation, establishing a culture where human life was a commodity and loyalty was a weakness to be exploited. George Trevor eventually realized the full extent of the nightmare he had walked into. After being held in a cell for days, he managed to escape, but he soon found that the mansion had changed. Spencer had altered the locks and rearranged the internal mechanisms, making George's own maps and memories obsolete. He wandered the halls like a ghost, his mind fracturing as he searched for Jessica and Lisa. Every door he tried was a dead end, and every secret passage led him deeper into a maze of his own making. He was a man lost in his own mind, trapped in a structure that was designed to confuse and kill. The descent into madness was documented in George's final notes, which he scribbled on scraps of paper as he wandered. He described the crushing silence of the mansion and the growing paranoia that he was being watched by Spencer's cameras. Starvation began to take its toll, and his handwriting became a jagged scrawl of despair. He found his own tombstone already engraved and placed in one of the hidden courtyards, a chilling sign that Spencer had planned his death long before he ever arrived. The sight of his own name on a grave broke what was left of his spirit. In his final days, George's notes turned toward his family. He apologized to Jessica and Lisa for bringing them to this place, his guilt as heavy as the stone walls around him. He realized that the illness Spencer had described was a lie, and he feared the worst for what was being done to them in the labs below. He spent his last hours in a hidden passage behind the fireplace, a small crawl space that he had once thought of as a clever architectural flourish. Now it was his coffin. He died in the dark, a victim of the very puzzles he had once considered a masterpiece. George Trevor's death was a lonely and pathetic end for a man of such great talent. He died of thirst and hunger, surrounded by the physical evidence of his own genius. His body remained hidden in the walls of the mansion for decades, a silent witness to the horrors that would follow. He had built the stage for a 30-year tragedy, and he was the first actor to be written out of the script. His final notes were a warning that no one would read until it was far too late, a heartbreaking record of a man who was sealed inside his own dream. The irony of George Trevor's fate is one of the most poignant elements of the Resident Evil lore. The man who knew every secret of the house was the one who could not find the way out. Spencer had turned George's creativity against him, proving that in the world of Umbrella, the creator is always at the mercy of the consumer. George's death established the mansion as a place of true evil, a structure that had tasted human blood and was ready for more. The architect was gone, but the tragedy of his daughter was only just beginning. While George was wandering the halls above, Jessica Trevor was being subjected to the first true human trials of the progenitor virus. She was injected with the Type A strain, a variant that the researchers hoped would lead to a stable mutation. Jessica, already weakened by the psychological trauma of her abduction and the separation from her daughter, was a poor candidate for the virus. Her body immediately began to fight the infection, but it was a battle she was destined to lose. The Type A strain was too aggressive for her system, leading to a rapid and violent decline in her physical and mental health. The trials were a series of agonizing tests designed to measure the virus's impact on her cellular structure. Jessica suffered from intense fever, muscular spasms, and a total loss of cognitive function within hours of the injection. The researchers watched with clinical detachment as her humanity was stripped away, her body failing to adapt to the rewrite of her genetic code. She was no longer a wife or a mother. She was a failing experiment. The scientists recorded every detail of her deterioration, using her suffering to refine the next strain of the virus. Jessica's body eventually failed completely. The cellular rejection was so violent that it led to rapid organ failure and a total shutdown of her nervous system. She died in the laboratory, her last conscious thoughts likely a frantic plea for the safety of her daughter. Because she was of no further use to the research, her remains were disposed of by the umbrella staff. Her death was unceremonious and hidden, a secret that would be kept from Lisa for the next 30 years. Jessica was the first casualty of the progenitor research, a woman whose life was extinguished in the name of a science she couldn't understand. The failure of the Type A strain in Jessica provided the researchers with the data they needed to adjust the dosage for Lisa. They realized that the adult immune system was too rigid to handle the progenitor rewrite, leading them to focus their attention on the more plastic biology of the child. Jessica's sacrifice was the dark foundation for Lisa's survival. If Jessica had not died, the researchers might not have found the right balance for her daughter. It was a tragedy built on top of a tragedy, where the mother's death was the price paid for the daughter's long-term suffering. Lisa remained unaware of her mother's fate, a fact the researchers used to keep her compliant. They would often lie to her, promising that she would see her mother if she cooperated with the injections. This manipulation created a psychological anchor for Lisa, a fixation on her mother that would survive the total collapse of her mind. Jessica Trevor was gone, but her memory became the ghost that would haunt Lisa for decades. The loss of Jessica was the first major blow to Lisa's soul, a void that she would try to fill by taking the faces of others in the years to come. On November 10th, 1967, the same day her mother was injected, Lisa Trevor was given her first dose of the progenitor virus Type B. She was only 11 years old, a child who had been ripped from her home and placed on a cold metal table. Unlike her mother, Lisa's body did not immediately shut down. The Type B strain found a strange and horrifying compatibility with her youthful cellular structure. Instead of rejecting the virus, Lisa's body began to slowly incorporate it, beginning a symbiosis that would last for 3 decades. The first injections were the beginning of Lisa's transformation into a biological anomaly. She experienced the same fevers and pain that had killed her mother, but her body had a freakish ability to regenerate and adapt. The scientists were astonished to see that her vitals remained stable, even as her genetic code was being rewritten. Lisa was the longest-running human experiment in the history of the company, a child whose biology was robust enough to endure 30 years of constant viral bombardment. She became the golden subject, the one who could survive anything they threw at her. For Lisa, the experience was a descent into a world of endless pain and confusion. She didn't understand why the doctors were hurting her, and she constantly asked for her mother and father. The sterile environment of the lab became her entire universe, the only color in her world being the pale blue of the chemical vials. At 11 years old, her life had been reduced to a series of injections and observations. She was a prisoner of her own resilience, her body's refusal to die being the very thing that ensured her continued suffering. The researchers became fascinated by Lisa's ability to tolerate the virus. They saw her as a biological goldmine, a source of infinite data that could lead to the perfection of the progenitor and T virus strains. Every time she survived a lethal dose, the scientists like Birkin and Marcus felt a surge of professional excitement. They didn't see a little girl, they saw a prototype for the future of humanity. Lisa's childhood was consumed by their ambition, her growth stunted and distorted by the viral agents that were now part of her blood. By the end of the first week, Lisa was no longer the girl who had arrived at the mansion. The virus had begun to alter her personality, making her more withdrawn and prone to sudden outbursts of aggression. The psychological trauma of the injections, combined with the isolation and the absence of her parents, began to break her young mind. She was the first successful human subject of the progenitor research, but the cost was her humanity. Lisa Trevor, age 11, had become the foundation of the Umbrella Corporation, a child who would grow into a monster while never stopping to cry for her mother. During the late 1960s, the progenitor virus was a death sentence for nearly every biological organism it touched. While Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford saw it as the ladder to godhood, the reality in the laboratory was far more gruesome. The virus was incredibly volatile, characterized by its absolute intolerance for weak genetic structures. In most test subjects, the virus caused a violent cellular rejection almost instantly. This was not a slow decline. It was a total systemic collapse. The researchers watched through reinforced glass as subject after subject underwent rapid organ failure or total brain death within mere minutes of exposure. The early failures were so consistent that the project was nearly deemed a dead end for human application. The human immune system viewed the progenitor virus as an ultimate invader, launching a counterattack so aggressive that the body essentially tore itself apart to stop the infection. Most subjects would go into grand mal seizures, followed by a liquefaction of internal tissues. For Umbrella, these people were disposable resources, but for the science, they were proof that the evolution Spencer craved was a gate that few were meant to pass through. The clinical data from this era painted a picture of a virus that demanded a perfect host. It required a specific type of genetic plasticity that was rarely found in adults. This is why the tragedy of the Trevor family was so significant to the research. They were the first bridge across the gap of failure. While dozens of other kidnapped victims were being hauled away in body bags, the scientists were refining their understanding of why the human body failed so spectacularly. They needed a subject who could handle the genetic rewrite without the host's own biology triggering a kill switch. By the time the researchers moved on to more refined strains, the basement of the Arklay mansion had become a graveyard for nameless subjects. These early failures established the cold, utilitarian culture of Umbrella's research division. Human life was measured in seconds of survival and percentages of viral integration. The scientists became desensitized to the screams, focused entirely on the chemical nuances of the progenitor strains. They were waiting for a miracle, and they found it in the small, terrified frame of Lisa Trevor. The atmosphere in the labs during these failures was one of clinical frustration rather than empathy. When a subject died, the body was removed, the table was bleached, and the next candidate was brought in. There was no mourning for the lives lost, only a frantic desire to please Spencer and secure more funding. The progenitor virus was a hungry god, and it required a mountain of corpses before it finally accepted a sacrifice. Lisa Trevor was the only one who did not vanish into that mountain of early failures. The sheer volume of death in the 1960s defined the architecture of the mansion's lower levels. Disposal chutes and incinerators were running constantly to keep up with the rate of rejection. It was a factory of death where the product was data. The scientists learned that the virus was not just a pathogen, but a complete biological overhaul. They realized that the host had to be young enough for their cells to be malleable, but strong enough to survive the shock. Lisa fit the criteria perfectly, standing alone where hundreds of adults had fallen. Lisa was a biological anomaly that defied every statistical probability the researchers had calculated. While her mother's body had been overwhelmed by type A, Lisa's biology entered a state of perfect, agonizing symbiosis with the type B strain. Her body did not reject the virus. It invited the infection into its deepest cellular structures. Instead of the virus killing her, it began a slow, systemic rewrite of her entire genetic code. She was the first human to ever reach a stable state with the progenitor virus, becoming a living vessel for the very thing that had vaporized the lives of so many others. This survival was not a mercy. It was a biological prison. The symbiosis preserved her life while systematically destroying her humanity. The virus did not just live in her blood. It became her blood. It began to alter her DNA at a fundamental level, ensuring that her cells would never stop replicating and would never succumb to standard decay. Lisa was becoming something that was no longer entirely human, a hybrid of girl and virus that represented the first true success of Spencer's vision. She was the proof that a human could endure the rewrite, provided their biology was plastic enough to bend without breaking. The researchers were stunned by her resilience. They monitored her vitals around the clock, expecting a delayed rejection that never came. Lisa's body was essentially absorbing the viral data, acting as a living hard drive for the progenitor strain. This lack of rejection meant that Umbrella finally had a permanent test subject, someone they could inject repeatedly over years without the fear of losing the host. Lisa's survival guaranteed her 3 decades of torment because she had proven herself to be unkillable in the eyes of the scientists. For Lisa, the survival meant a life of perpetual fever and sensory overload. The virus was constantly shifting within her, a liquid fire that she could feel in her bones. She remained in a state of high stress, her young mind unable to process the fact that she was becoming a monster. The symbiotic relationship meant that as long as the virus lived, she lived, and since the virus was designed for immortality, Lisa was condemned to a life that had no natural end. She was the anomaly that made the nightmare possible. Every day that Lisa stayed alive, the scientists grew more bold. They began to view her as a resource rather than a person. Her survival allowed them to move past the basic questions of viability and into the more complex territory of weaponization. They started to wonder how much more she could take, pushing her limits with higher concentrations and more frequent doses. Lisa's body responded to every challenge by adapting, her cells locking onto the virus as if it were oxygen. She was the first successful birth of a new species, born in pain and destined for silence. The discovery of her symbiosis changed the power dynamic within the mansion. Researchers who were once afraid of the progenitor virus now saw it as a tool they could master. They studied her blood under microscopes, watching as the viral particles danced around her red blood cells without destroying them. It was a beautiful, horrific dance of biology that promised a future of limitless power for those who could control it. Lisa was the only one who knew the true cost of that dance, a child whose very existence had become a scientific miracle. Initial observations in the months following her first injection noted that Lisa was developing physical traits that were clearly superhuman. The most prominent of these was her heightened pain tolerance. Giant procedures that should have caused her to go into shock were met with a dull, distant response. It was as if her nervous system was being recalibrated by the virus, distancing her consciousness from the physical trauma being inflicted upon her. More terrifying to the researchers was her abnormal regeneration. Wounds inflicted during biopsies or surgical investigations would close in seconds, leaving behind thick, discolored scar tissue. The regeneration was not clean, it was aggressive. The virus was so focused on preserving the host that it overcompensated during the healing process, leading to the first signs of physical distortion. Her skin began to thicken, taking on a grey, leathery texture that was resistant to standard medical tools. She survived dosages of experimental chemicals and viral boosters that would have been instantly fatal to an adult male. The scientists realized that Lisa's body was becoming a biological fortress, one that was capable of repelling almost any external threat while mutating internally. These early mutations were the first step in the loss of her human form. Her limbs began to show signs of unnatural elongation, and her bone density increased to a point that made her movements heavy and deliberate. The girl was being replaced by a specimen. The researchers noted that her physical strength was growing far beyond what should be possible for an 11-year-old. A development that necessitated stronger restraints and higher security during her sessions. Every mutation was documented as a victory for Umbrella, regardless of the agony it caused the subject. The most chilling sign of mutation was her eyes. They began to lose the clarity of a child, replaced by a dull, predatory glow that suggested the virus was beginning to influence her primal instincts. While she could still speak at this stage, her voice was becoming deeper and more distorted. The first signs of mutation were the visible cracks in the vessel of her humanity. Lisa Trevor was being slowly rewritten into a biological weapon, her body becoming a canvas for the most horrific experiments in human history. As her skin hardened, it began to pull tightly over her growing frame. She experienced constant growing pains that were amplified by the viral activity in her marrow. The scientists noted that her body temperature was consistently higher than normal, so as if her metabolism was running at an overclocked rate. This high-energy state allowed her to regenerate massive amounts of tissue in an instant, but it also meant she was constantly hungry and agitated. She was no longer just a subject. She was becoming a force of nature that the researchers struggled to contain. By the end of 1968, the first year of her captivity, Lisa was already a ghost of her former self. The mutations were subtle at first, but became more pronounced with every passing month. She would sometimes stare at her hands for hours, watching the way her skin shifted and changed color. She was losing the map of her own body, replaced by a topography of scars and viral growths. The researchers celebrated these changes as signs of progress, never stopping to consider the psychological weight of a child watching herself turn into a monster. For the next 30 years, Lisa Trevor was used as a biological sink for every new strain and prototype Umbrella developed. She was the foundation upon which the T virus was built. Researchers like James Marcus and eventually a young William Birkin used her as a living laboratory, injecting her with multiple variations of the T virus and its countless prototypes. Because she could not die, she became the ultimate filter. Her body would absorb the most lethal elements of these strains, process them, and survive, leaving behind a conglomerate of viral data in her blood that was more valuable than any computer simulation. This period was a relentless cycle of trauma. Every time a new discovery was made in the labs beneath the mansion, it was first tested on Lisa. She was injected with strains derived from leeches, insects, and other creatures, her body forced to integrate these foreign genetic codes into her own. Over the decades, she became a melting pot of every biological horror Umbrella had ever conceived. Her blood was no longer human. It was a swirling cocktail of progenitor and T virus variants that were constantly competing and evolving within her system. The sheer volume of viral bombardment she endured would have destroyed any other creature on Earth. But Lisa's symbiosis with the original progenitor strain made her a permanent host. She was a golden subject because she never hit a limit. The more they injected, the more she mutated, and the more her body adapted to the new threats. This made her a biological goldmine for William Birkin, who became obsessed with her unique cellular structure. He saw her as the key to the next stage of human evolution, a perspective that allowed him to treat her like a piece of equipment for over 20 years. The continuous injections meant that Lisa was never allowed to heal or stabilize. She was in a permanent state of mutation, her body a battlefield for various viral agents. This constant state of flux prevented her from ever regaining any sense of normalcy or peace. She was a living record of Umbrella's progress, her scars and mutations telling the story of the company's growth from a small research firm into a global powerhouse. For 30 years, Lisa Trevor was the most important person in the Arklay mansion, and she was also the most forgotten. Each new injection brought a different kind of pain. Some strains made her skin slough off in sheets, only for the progenitor virus to knit it back together even thicker and tougher than before. Other strains caused her organs to swell, or her bones to fracture under the pressure of new growth. Through it all, Lisa remained conscious, a witness to the dismantling of her own biology. The scientists kept careful logs of these reactions, noting which T virus variants caused the most aggressive physical changes. Lisa was the canvas, and their needles were the brushes. By the late 80s, the researchers were no longer even pretending to look for a cure or a stabilization method for her. They were simply using her to refine the lethality of their products. So they wanted to see how much of the T virus her system could hold before it reached a point of critical mass. Lisa's body became a vessel of pure entropy, a place where the laws of biology were broken daily. She was the mother of the modern bioweapon, her 30 years of suffering providing the genetic map for the monsters that would eventually destroy Raccoon City. As the decades passed and the viral load in her system increased, Lisa's mental capacity began a heartbreaking and steady decline. Her early journal entries, written shortly after her arrival, were those of an articulate and frightened 11-year-old girl. She wrote about her father's work, her mother's absence, and her desire to go home. However, as the T virus strains began to eat away at her frontal lobe, the handwriting and the complexity of her thoughts began to regress. The journals became a physical record of a mind being erased by science. By the mid-1970s, The entries devolved into repetitive, misspelled phrases. She began to lose the ability to form complex sentences, her thoughts narrowing down to basic needs and the overwhelming trauma of her environment. The regression was not just a loss of vocabulary, it was a loss of self. The virus was replacing her cognitive functions with primal survival instincts. The girl who once loved music and puzzles was being replaced by a creature that only understood pain and the vague, flickering memory of a woman she called mother. By the early 1980s, her ability to form coherent thoughts had vanished entirely. Her journals from this period are a nightmare of jagged scrawl and ink blots. She could no longer remember her own name or the face of her father. Language had become a foreign concept to her, replaced by grunts, shrieks, and a low, mournful moaning that echoed through the lower levels of the mansion. The civilized part of her brain had been consumed by the viral infection, leaving behind only the most ancient, lizard-like parts of her consciousness. This cognitive collapse was a deliberate observation for the researchers. They tracked her language loss as a metric for the T virus's effect on human intelligence. They didn't see the tragedy of a girl losing her voice. They saw the successful suppression of the higher brain functions in favor of a more aggressive, easily controlled biological weapon. Lisa's silence was a success in their eyes. The fading of her words marked the final death of the 11-year-old girl, leaving only the specimen that Umbrella had spent 20 years perfecting. The last few entries in her journal that contained actual words were centered on her confusion. She would write the word mother over and over, as if the physical act of writing it could keep the image of Jessica alive in her mind. Eventually, even the letters began to lose their shape, turning into meaningless symbols that reflected the chaos in her brain. The T virus had effectively lobotomized her, stripping away everything that made her a social, thinking being. She was left in a world of pure sensation, where the only thing that made sense was the agony of her existence. The loss of language also meant a loss of time. Without the ability to structure her thoughts, Lisa's sense of the past and future evaporated. She existed in a permanent, agonizing present. She didn't know how long she had been in the mansion, or how old she was. She was trapped in a moment of trauma that never ended. The researchers noted that her lack of verbal communication made her easier to handle in some ways, but her unpredictable, primal reactions made her far more dangerous. She had become a silent predator, driven by a grief she could no longer name. Even as her memory collapsed and her language faded, one single conscious thought remained anchored in Lisa's mind: her mother, Jessica. This fixation was the only thing the virus could not erase. It became her primary psychological driver, a desperate, primal need for the comfort she had lost in 1967. Because the researchers realized that this was her only remaining handle, they used it against her. They would often dress female researchers in Jessica's old clothes, or have them speak in a soothing voice to keep Lisa compliant during painful procedures. This manipulation had a horrific psychological effect. Lisa developed a violent and possessive fixation on the idea of her mother. When she realized that the women in the lab were not actually Jessica, her grief would turn into a blinding rage. She began to view every woman she encountered as a potential mother, and when they inevitably failed to be the person she remembered, Lisa would react with lethal force. Her obsession was the only thing that gave her life meaning. Yet it was also the source of her greatest suffering, as she was forced to relive the loss of her mother every single day. Lisa's fixation eventually turned into a grotesque physical quest. She became convinced that if she could find her mother's face, she could put her family back together. This led to her attacking female staff and literally taking their faces, trying to find the one that belonged to Jessica. This was not an act of malice, but a fragmented attempt at reconnection. In her broken mind, the skin of these women held the secret to her mother's return. She was a child playing a horrific game of dress-up, trying to piece together a reality that had been shattered decades ago. The researchers were fascinated by this persistent obsession. They noted that the progenitor virus had somehow preserved this specific emotional trauma, weaving it into her mutated biology. It was a rare example of a viral subject retaining a human motivation. To Lisa, Mother was no longer a person. It was a holy relic, a destination, and a cure for the fire in her blood. Her anchor was a lie, and the company's willingness to exploit that lie was perhaps the greatest cruelty they ever inflicted upon her. The shrine she eventually built in the underground areas of the mansion was a testament to this obsession. She collected small items that reminded her of her mother, arranging them with a strange, ritualistic care. This behavior showed that even in her most monstrous form, there was still a spark of the girl who had arrived in 1967. She was mourning a loss she couldn't fully comprehend, her entire existence dedicated to a ghost. The researchers watched these behaviors through their monitors, analyzing her grief as if it were just another symptom of the T virus. Lisa would spend hours whispering the word mother to the air, her voice a gravelly ruin of what it once was. She would touch the rough stones of the walls as if she could feel her mother's presence through the architecture her father had built. This obsession was the only thing that kept her from becoming a completely mindless beast. It was a double-edged sword that provided her with a shred of identity, while ensuring that her psychological torture was as eternal as her biological life. She was a daughter who had been abandoned by everyone but her own grief. By the early 1990s, Lisa Trevor's physical form was unrecognizable as anything human. The cumulative effect of 30 years of viral injections had resulted in a body that was a distorted, elongated nightmare. Her limbs had grown unnaturally long, her fingers ending in thick, blackened nails that could tear through flesh and bone. Her spine had warped under the weight of her mutated musculature, giving her a hunched, predatory gait. She was a mass of grey, leathery skin and corded muscle, a testament to the raw power of the viruses she carried. Her physical strength had reached superhuman levels. Despite her distorted frame, she could move with a surprising, jerky speed when provoked. She was often seen dragging heavy metal shackles and chains, which she swung as if they were weightless. These restraints, meant to keep her contained, had simply become a part of her silhouette. Her skin was so thick that conventional weaponry was almost entirely useless against her. Bullets would simply flatten against her hide, or be pushed out by her rapidly regenerating tissues. She was the ultimate tank, a creature that could endure an army's worth of punishment. The elongation of her body was accompanied by a total loss of facial features. Her head was often shrouded in the layers of skin she had taken from others, and her own features had been swallowed by the thickening of her skull and skin. She was a faceless horror, a physical manifestation of the erasure of the Trevor family. The only thing that remained was her size, as she towered over the average human, a hulking presence that dominated any room she entered. She was the physical peak of what the T virus could do to a human host, without the host becoming a mindless puddle of biomass. Lisa's transformation was a source of pride for the Arklay researchers. They viewed her as the mother of their research, the vessel that had allowed them to perfect the science of biological weaponry. To them, her distorted limbs and leathery skin were beautiful examples of adaptation. To anyone else, she was a walking crime against nature. She was the physical evidence of 30 years of unchecked ambition, a girl who had been stretched and hardened into a monster to satisfy the ego of a man who wanted to be a god. The sheer mass of her body made her movements sound like the shifting of heavy stone. When she walked, the floorboards of the mansion would groan under her weight. Her presence was always preceded by the rhythmic clanking of her chains, a sound that became synonymous with death for the researchers. She was a living monument to Umbrella's cruelty, a masterpiece of horror that was never meant to be seen by the outside world. Her physical form was a prison that she would inhabit until the very end of the Arklay incident. Even the way she breathed had changed. Her lungs were now massive, efficient organs that could pull in huge amounts of oxygen to fuel her rapid regeneration. Every breath was a deep, wet rattle that echoed in the corridors. Her body was a high-performance machine of destruction, but it was also a tomb for the girl who had once lived inside it. The physical transformation was complete, leaving Lisa Trevor as a creature of pure survival, a monster that had forgotten it was ever anything else. As the years stretched into decades, the research team at the Arklay facility became increasingly fascinated with the fact that Lisa Trevor was essentially unkillable. In the high-stakes world of biological weapon development, durability was the ultimate goal, and Lisa was the living proof that a host could reach a state of absolute immortality. She was no longer viewed as a patient or even a standard test subject. She became a biological goldmine. Every time she survived a lethal injection of a new T-virus strain, she proved that a perfect host was possible, fueling the massive egos of scientists like William Birkin and Albert Wesker. William Birkin, in particular, saw Lisa as the crown jewel of his career. He was fascinated by her ability to synthesize the various viral agents into a single, cohesive biological system. To Birkin, Lisa was a glimpse into the future of the human race, a version of humanity that was immune to death and decay. This obsession led to a period of intensified experimentation, where the researchers pushed Lisa's body to the absolute breaking point. They wanted to find the limit of her regeneration, subjecting her to horrific physical trauma, just to watch her cells knit themselves back together in the aftermath. The interest in Lisa also had a financial and strategic component for the Umbrella Corporation. She was the anchor for their most profitable research lines, and her survival ensured that they had a constant supply of unique genetic material. The senior leadership, including Oswell E. Spencer himself, she received regular reports on her status. She was the secret foundation upon which the company's global dominance was being built. As long as Lisa lived, Umbrella had a lead over every other pharmaceutical and military organization in the world, making her the most valuable asset in their entire inventory. This intensified interest meant that Lisa was moved to the most secure levels of the underground laboratory. Her environment became even more sterile and isolated, a place where only the highest level researchers were allowed to interact with her. The scientific curiosity surrounding her was devoid of any moral consideration. The researchers spoke of her in the same way they might discuss a high-performance engine or a sophisticated computer system. Her suffering was merely a byproduct of the data they were harvesting, a necessary cost for the advancement of their viral programs. By the late 1980s, Lisa's status as a biological miracle was undisputed within the Arklay halls. She had survived longer than any other human subject in history, and her body continued to produce new, reactive viral data. The fascinations of the researchers turned into a form of worship for the monster they had created. They saw her as the mother of the T virus, the primary source from which all their other horrors flowed. Lisa was the heart of the mansion, a pulsing, grieving mass of biomass that kept the entire Umbrella project alive through her sheer refusal to die. In 1988, the research took a radical and terrifying turn. William Birkin, seeking to bridge the gap between biological weapons and tactical control, decided to inject Lisa with the Ne-alpha parasite, better known as the Nemesis parasite. This was a sophisticated organism developed by Umbrella's European branch, designed to inhabit the host's brain and take over their central nervous system. The goal was to create a creature that possessed the raw power of a tyrant, but remained entirely controllable through external commands. The parasite was a living brain, intended to replace the host's own shattered mind. The implantation process was a major event in the laboratory. Birkin believed that Lisa's unique, stable biology would provide the perfect environment for the parasite to thrive. Normally, the Ne-alpha parasite was so aggressive that it would kill the host within minutes if their genetic makeup was not a perfect match. Birkin hoped that Lisa's 30 years of viral adaptation would allow her to survive the initial shock of the parasite's entry. He saw this as the final step in turning her into a true weapon, combining her invincibility with the parasite's tactical intelligence. The procedure involved a direct injection of the parasite into Lisa's spinal column, allowing it to migrate toward her brain. The researchers monitored the process with bated breath, watching the screens for any sign of rejection or systemic collapse. For the first time in years, even Birkin was nervous, as the Ne-alpha was the most sophisticated biological agent they had ever produced. They expected a struggle for dominance between Lisa's immune system and the parasite, a battle that would decide the future of the Nemesis project. As the parasite reached her brain, Lisa's body went into violent convulsions. Her regeneration kicked into an overdrive that the researchers had never seen before, her skin rippling as if something was moving beneath the surface. The laboratory was filled with the sound of her screaming, a sound that bypassed the higher brain and came from a place of pure, animalistic agony. The researchers noted that her vital signs were fluctuating wildly, her body fighting the intruder with a ferocity that suggested the progenitor virus within her was not willing to share its host. This implantation represented the ultimate violation of Lisa's autonomy. And not content with rewriting her DNA and stealing her mind, Umbrella was now trying to install a literal foreign consciousness into her skull. They wanted to turn her into an organic puppet, a biological machine that would follow orders without hesitation. The Ne-alpha parasite was the cold, intellectual peak of Umbrella's cruelty. A parasite designed to ensure that even the memory of Mother would be erased and replaced by the company's voice. Part 17. The parasite is rejected. What happened next was a scientific anomaly that shattered Birkin's expectations. Lisa's body did not just reject the Ne-alpha parasite, it actively consumed it. Instead of the parasite taking over her brain and assuming control, Lisa's immune system, bolstered by 2 decades of progenitor and T virus exposure, recognized the parasite as a threat and launched a counterattack. Her cellular structure, which had been tempered by every lethal agent Umbrella possessed, was far too aggressive for the parasite to handle. The hunter became the prey within the confines of her own nervous system. The researchers watched in disbelief as the parasite's signatures began to fade from their monitors. Lisa's body was literally absorbing the NE-alpha, integrating its regenerative and adaptive properties into her own DNA. She had become a biological black hole, an organism that took in everything and gave nothing back. The parasite, which had been designed to be the ultimate master of a host, was dismantled at a cellular level and processed by Lisa's blood. It was a total failure of the Nemesis project's goal, but it opened the door to something far more significant. This absorption was the ultimate proof of Lisa's status as a biological god. She had conquered an organism that was designed to conquer her. The researchers realized that her body was capable of spontaneous evolution, reacting to new threats by incorporating them into her own design. This made her more than just a test subject. She was a self-evolving biological engine. The parasite's ability to heal and adapt was now part of Lisa's permanent genetic makeup, making her even more difficult to kill than she had been before the procedure. For Lisa, the rejection of the parasite was a victory of the spirit, even if she wasn't conscious of it. Her mind remained hers, however shattered and fragmented it was. The parasite could not find a foothold in a brain that was already so consumed by the grief of a lost childhood. The rejection showed that Lisa Trevor was not a blank slate to be written upon. She was a fortress of trauma and viral data that refused to be occupied. Birkin was left with a failure that was also a massive breakthrough, a paradox that would lead him to his greatest discovery. The data gathered during the parasite's destruction provided the first clues about the stability of the host. Birkin realized that Lisa's blood had changed after consuming the NE-alpha. It had become more reactive and more capable of rapid, unpredictable mutation. This was the moment the research shifted away from the T virus and toward a new horizon. Lisa had survived the best that Umbrella Europe had to offer, and in doing so, she had birthed a new era of biological horror in her own veins. Part 18, The Birth of the G Research Lineage. When William Birkin analyzed the blood samples taken from Lisa following the parasite absorption, he discovered that a new, highly reactive viral strain had formed. This was not the T virus, and it was no longer the pure progenitor strain. It was a completely new entity, a virus that responded to the host's physical needs and environmental stresses with unprecedented speed. Birkin realized that he was looking at the future of the company's research. He named this new discovery the G virus, and Lisa Trevor was its mother. The birth of the G virus was the direct result of Lisa's 30 years of suffering. Without her unique ability to survive decades of viral bombardment and her eventual absorption of the Nemesis parasite, the G virus would never have existed. Her body had acted as a biological forge, melting down every agent Umbrella had injected into her and hammering them into something new and terrifying. Birkin was ecstatic, realizing that the G virus offered a path to true evolution through spontaneous mutation, a goal that had eluded the company for decades. This discovery changed the way Umbrella viewed Lisa. She was no longer just a subject to be tested. She was the source of a new, multi-billion-dollar research lineage. Birkin spent the next several years harvesting G virus samples from her blood, refining the strain that would eventually lead to the destruction of Raccoon City. Lisa's existence had become the most important secret in the world, a secret that was hidden deep beneath the Arklay mansion. She was the fountainhead of a new species of monster, her very blood containing the blueprints for a biological apocalypse. The ethical implications of the G virus's birth were ignored by Birkin and the other researchers. They didn't care that the virus was born from the systematic torture of a child. They only cared about the power it represented. To them, Lisa was a successful manufacturing plant. They continued to harvest her, their needles pulling the G virus from her veins while she sat in her chains, whispering for a mother who would never come. The G research lineage was built on a foundation of 30 years of tears and chemical fire. The G virus was Birkin's obsession, and he guarded the source of his research with a jealous ferocity. He moved his primary operations to Raccoon City, but the core data remained linked to the girl in the mansion. Lisa Trevor had given Umbrella the keys to a new kingdom, and in exchange, they continued to treat her as an object. She was the original sin of the G virus, a reminder that the most sophisticated bioweapons in the world were born from the most basic human cruelty. Part 19. The faces she wears. As her mind continued to collapse into a state of cognitive fragmentation, Lisa's obsession with her mother took on a horrific physical manifestation. She began to attack female researchers and staff who entered her containment area, but she didn't just kill them. She used her sharpened nails to carefully remove their faces, a process she had learned through some dark, instinctual understanding of the anatomy she had seen in the labs. She was looking for Jessica's face, convinced that if she could find the right one, her mother would finally come back to her. The symbolism of this behavior was a direct reflection of her shattered identity. Lisa no longer knew what she looked like. Her own face had been swallowed by years of leathery skin and viral growth. By wearing the faces of others, she was trying to reconstruct her own sense of self through a crude, literal interpretation of memory. She would layer these skins over her own head, creating a grotesque, multi-layered mask of human flesh. To anyone who saw her, she was a faceless horror, but in her own mind, she was simply trying to find a way to be a daughter again. The mask she wore was a physical manifestation of her trauma. It was a shield against the reality of what she had become, and a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between 1967 and the present. She wore the faces like holy relics, believing that they held the power to bring her mother back to life. The researchers who found the bodies of her victims were horrified, not just by the violence, but by the strange, ritualistic care she took in the taking of the faces. It was a child's logic applied with a monster's strength. This skin graft fixation also made her a much more dangerous subject to handle. She became predatory, lurking in the shadows of the underground facility and waiting for a female voice to echo in the dark. She was no longer just a passive subject. She was a hunter of identities. The layers of skin on her face began to rot and dry, turning into a blackened, leathery husk that gave her a terrifying, silent expression. She had become a faceless ghost, a creature who wore the tragedy of others to hide the tragedy of herself. The psychological significance of the faces was not lost on all of the researchers. Some noted in their logs that Lisa seemed to find comfort in the layers of skin, as if they provided a warmth that her own cold, viral blood could not. It was a heartbreaking realization that even in her most monstrous state, she was still driven by a fundamental human need for connection. She was a girl lost in a house of mirrors, and the only way she knew to find the exit was to take the faces of the people who held her captive. Part 20. Loss of Self. By the mid-1990s, Lisa Trevor as a human being had ceased to exist. The cognitive fragmentation was total. She no longer had any memory of her name, her age, or her life before the mansion. The girl who had arrived at the party in 1967 was dead, replaced by a mass of sentient, grieving biomass. Her consciousness had narrowed down to a single, white-hot point of pain and a primal need for her mother. Everything else, her father, her dreams, her very identity, had been burned away by 30 years of viral bombardment. This loss of self was the ultimate victory for Umbrella. They had successfully turned a human being into a pure biological resource. There was no personality left to resist them, no intellect to question their methods. Lisa was a blank slate of muscle and virus, a creature that responded only to external stimuli and the deep-rooted trauma in her nervous system. She was a living ghost, wandering the corridors of the lower levels without any sense of purpose or destination. She was a monument to the erasure of the human spirit. Her memory collapse meant that she no longer understood the passage of time. She didn't know that 3 decades had passed since she last saw the sun. To Lisa, the pain of 1967 was as fresh as the pain of the most recent injection. She existed in a permanent state of psychological shock, a trauma that was refreshed every time she woke up and found herself in a cage. The cognitive fragmentation was her body's way of protecting what was left of her mind, a final defense against a reality that was too horrific to bear. The researchers noted that she would sometimes stand still for hours, as if she was trying to remember something that was just out of reach. These moments of stillness were the only times she seemed peaceful, a flicker of the girl she once was trying to break through the viral noise. But the virus always won, dragging her back into the present where there was only hunger and the clanking of her chains. She was a prisoner in a body she didn't recognize, in a place she didn't remember, serving a company that had stolen her soul. The loss of self also made her unpredictable. Without a stable identity to anchor her actions, her behavior was governed by pure instinct and the flickering shadows of her mother's memory. She could be passive one moment and a whirlwind of lethal violence the next. She was a creature of pure entropy, a physical manifestation of the chaos that Umbrella had unleashed. Lisa Trevor was gone, and in her place was a monster that didn't even know it had a name. In the mid-1990s, Umbrella officially deemed Lisa Trevor useless. The G virus had been successfully harvested and stabilized in Birkin's new facility in Raccoon City, and the research at the Arklay Mansion was moving toward newer, more controllable tyrant models. Lisa was no longer the cutting edge of their research. She was an obsolete prototype, a relic of a previous era. The order was given to dispose of her, an execution that was intended to be the final chapter of her 30-year story. But as it had been so many times before, Lisa's body refused to comply with the plan. The execution attempt was brutal. The researchers utilized high-powered toxins and direct physical trauma, believing that her regeneration finally had a limit. They dumped her body in a secluded area of the Arklay estate, treating her like the biological waste they had always considered her to be. But the G virus and the progenitor strain within her blood had other plans. Despite the massive damage inflicted upon her, Lisa's body began to knit itself back together in the dark. She did not die. She simply transitioned from a prisoner to a ghost. She began to roam the underground tunnels and the secluded areas of the Arklay forest, a shadow beneath the mansion her father had built. She was released from her cage, but she was not free. She was still bound by the chains of her trauma and the biological imperatives of the viruses in her blood. She lived in the gaps of the facility, a monster that the new researchers had only heard about in hushed rumors. She was the ghost in the machine, a remnant of the mansion's original sin that refused to be buried. Lisa's freedom was a lonely, predatory existence. She moved through the underground areas with a sense of familiarity. her father's architecture still guiding her movements, even if she didn't remember why. She stayed close to the mansion because it was the only world she knew, and because she still believed that her mother was somewhere within its walls. She became an urban legend among the Umbrella staff, the monster of the Arklay, a creature that lived in the dark and took the faces of those who wandered too far from the light. This period of her life was one of total isolation. She was no longer being injected or studied, but she was still suffering. Her mutations continued to evolve in the wild, her body adapting to the harsh environment of the underground tunnels. She was a creature that should not have existed, a biological impossibility that had been cast out by its creators. Lisa Trevor was wandering the Arklay Mountains, a girl in a monster's skin, waiting for the world to catch up to her tragedy. Part 22. The Underground Cabin and Chains. During the years following her failed execution, Lisa Trevor sought refuge in the deepest, most forgotten corners of the Arklay estate. She eventually took up residence in a dilapidated wooden cabin situated deep within the forest and connected to the mansion via a series of damp, subterranean tunnels. This cabin became her sanctuary, a place where the sterile white lights of the laboratory could not reach her. It was here that the environmental storytelling of her life truly manifested, as she filled the space with the remnants of her shattered existence. The cabin was a rotting tomb, but to Lisa, it was the closest thing she had to a home since 1967. The most chilling aspect of her presence in the cabin was the sound of her movement. She was permanently weighed down by massive rusted metal shackles and heavy iron chains that had been bolted to her wrists and ankles during her time in containment. Because she possessed superhuman strength, she did not view these as restraints so much as part of her own body. The rhythmic clanking of these chains against the wooden floorboards and stone tunnels became a herald of doom for any Umbrella operative who ventured too close. The chains were a physical manifestation of her eternal servitude to a company that had abandoned her, a sound that echoed through the woods like a funeral knell. In the darkness of the cabin, Lisa attempted to recreate the warmth of a family she could no longer name. She lit candles and arranged small, meaningless trinkets in a way that mimicked a child's idea of a shrine. These objects were her only anchors to reality, representing a desperate attempt to fend off the total cognitive collapse that the viruses were forcing upon her. She would sit in the shadows for days at a time, the chains rattling softly as she swayed back and forth, trapped in a cycle of grief that had no beginning and no end. She was the monster beneath the mansion, a ghost that Umbrella chose to ignore rather than confront. Umbrella's management of the Arklay facility eventually became aware of her survival, but they chose to leave her be, viewing her as a natural deterrent for trespassers. They occasionally sent security teams to restrain her if she wandered too close to the main laboratory entrances, but for the most part, she was treated as part of the background noise of the estate. She was a living biological hazard that they simply worked around. This period of her life was defined by a profound, echoing loneliness, where her only company was the flickering flame of a candle and the heavy metallic weight of her own history. The cabin served as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the monsters. To the S.T.A.R.S team, who would eventually discover it, the cabin was a place of pure, concentrated horror that didn't fit the clinical nature of the rest of the facility. It felt ancient and cursed, a place where the laws of nature had been suspended. Lisa was the architect of this space, a girl who had built a nest in the ruins of her father's dream. She was no longer a subject being observed through a glass partition. She was a primal force of the forest, a legend of the Arklay Mountains that was waiting for the final act of her tragedy to begin. The final journal entries found within Lisa's cabin and the tunnels are perhaps the most devastating pieces of evidence in the Resident Evil lore. By the time of the 1998 incident, her handwriting had devolved into a jagged, violent scrawl that barely resembled human script. The entries show a total emotional and intellectual deterioration, with the complex sentences of her childhood replaced by a singular, obsessive focus. The word mother is repeated hundreds of times, often filling entire pages from margin to margin. This was no longer communication. It was a rhythmic, desperate prayer for a savior who had been dead for 30 years. A line-by-line analysis of these documents reveals the exact moment her mind finally shattered. In the earlier family diary entries, she describes the scary men and the medicine they gave her, still holding on to the hope that her father would come to save her. But the later entries, written after she had been discarded by the lab, show a horrifying regression. She writes about the itchy feeling in her skin and the way her face feels like it doesn't belong to her. The breakdown is not just mental, but physical, as she records her own transformation with a sense of confused, childish detachment that is more chilling than any medical report. The most famous of these entries is a jagged note where she writes about giving her mother her face back. This reveals the true, tragic motivation behind her skin graft fixation. In her mind, she believed that by taking the faces of others, she was collecting the parts necessary to repair her mother. She didn't understand death. She only understood that her mother was missing her face. And as a good daughter, it was her job to find it. The emotional deterioration shown in these pages is total. She had lost the ability to distinguish between herself and the biomass she was consuming. Her entire existence narrowed down to a single, unfulfilled need for maternal comfort. These journals serve as a psychological autopsy of a stolen life. They prove that even after 30 years of viral bombardment, the core of Lisa Trevor remained an 11-year-old girl. The T virus could rewrite her DNA, and the G virus could mutate her flesh, but neither could erase the fundamental human need for a mother's love. The repetition of the word mother was her only shield against the void of the virus. It was a loop of trauma that played over and over in her mind, a broken record that only stopped when the screaming began. The journals are a record of a soul being slowly suffocated by biology. The tragedy of the journal breakdown is that it highlights the absolute failure of Umbrella's attempt to turn her into a mindless weapon. They wanted a soldier, but they were left with a grieving child. Her entries are the only voice she has left, a silent scream from the bottom of a well that no one would hear for 3 decades. When Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield read these notes, they are not looking at a monster's manifesto. They are looking at the final, desperate thoughts of a victim who was never allowed to grow up. The journal is the most human thing about Lisa, and it is also the most horrific. Part 24. The Monster Beneath the Mansion. In the Resident Evil remake, Lisa Trevor is introduced through masterful environmental storytelling that builds a sense of dread long before the player ever sees her. The heavy, rhythmic sound of her chains dragging against stone is the first indication of her presence, a sound that pierces the silence of the underground passages. Unlike the other creatures in the mansion, which are the result of accidental leaks, Lisa represents the intentional, calculated cruelty of the facility's founders. She is the original sin of the Arklay Mountains, a monster that was built by hand through 30 years of systematic abuse. Her design in the remake emphasizes her status as a victim. She is hunched and distorted, her arms bound by wood and metal, her face covered by a mask of rotting skin grafts. She does not move like a predator. She moves like a wounded animal, her gait heavy and labored. This visual storytelling communicates her history of captivity without a single line of dialogue. Every element of her appearance, from the shackles to the tattered remains of her clothing, tells the story of a girl who was never allowed to leave her prison. She is a walking graveyard of Umbrella's early research, a physical manifestation of the secrets George Trevor tried to hide. The shrine she built beneath the altar is the emotional heart of her presence in the game. It is a place of candles and photographs, a small pocket of humanity in a world of monsters. This shrine shows that Lisa was not wandering aimlessly. She was standing guard over the memory of her family. She represents a constant, invincible threat that the S.T.A.R.S operatives cannot defeat through conventional means. While other zombies can be killed with a well-placed shot, Lisa simply shrugs off bullets, her body knitting itself back together instantly. This invincibility forces the player to feel the same sense of helplessness that Lisa herself felt for 30 years. The atmosphere surrounding her encounters is thick with a sense of ancient, lingering sorrow. She is often heard moaning the word mother in a voice that sounds like grinding stone, a sound that turns a typical horror encounter into a moment of profound tragedy. She is the monster beneath the mansion, not because of her violence, but because of the reality she represents. She is the proof that Umbrella's power was built on the suffering of the innocent. To encounter Lisa is to confront the truth of the Spencer mansion, that it was never a home, and it was never just a lab. It was a factory of human misery. Ultimately, Lisa Trevor serves as a dark mirror to the S.T.A.R.S protagonists. While they are there to solve a mystery, she is the mystery itself, a survivor of a war that began before they were even born. She is the ghost that haunts the architecture, a reminder that the past can never be truly buried. Her presence in the game elevates the horror from simple jump scares to a deep existential dread. She is the child that the mansion swallowed, and she is the monster that will ensure no one else ever feels safe within its walls. When the S.T.A.R.S Alpha team arrived at the mansion in July 1998, they had no idea they were walking into the final act of a 30-year tragedy. Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield encountered Lisa several times as they navigated the forest and the underground tunnels. From their first meeting in the cabin, it was clear that Lisa was unlike any other creature they had faced. She was completely immune to their conventional weaponry, her grey, leathery skin acting as a natural armor that no bullet could pierce. She did not hunt them with the tactical precision of a hunter or the speed of a Cerberus. She simply followed them, an unstoppable force of grief and iron. But these encounters were defined by a sense of mounting dread. Lisa acted as an invincible stalker character, forcing the operatives to flee or use the environment to slow her down. To Jill and Chris, she was an enigma, a creature that wore human faces and cried out for a mother while trying to crush them with her shackles. They found her journals and the evidence of her parents' fate, slowly piecing together the horrific truth of her identity. They realized that they weren't fighting a bioweapon. They were fighting a survivor who had been driven insane by the very company they were investigating. The encounters with Lisa was strategically designed to test the player's nerves. She would appear in cramped corridors and dark tunnels, her chains clanking in the distance as a warning. Jean, there was no way to win these fights in the traditional sense, which reinforced the theme of Lisa's resilience. She was a creature that had survived 30 years of Umbrella's best efforts to destroy her. A few S.T.A.R.S officers with handguns were never going to be enough. These moments forced the protagonists to confront the limits of their own power and the sheer scale of the evil they were dealing with. Lisa's presence during the mansion incident also served to distract the S.T.A.R.S team from the other threats, acting as a chaotic variable that even Wesker could not fully control. She was a remnant of an older era of research that had outlived its creators. For Jill and Chris, every encounter was a reminder of the human cost of the T-virus. They saw the little girl beneath the layers of skin and the mutated muscle, and it fueled their desire to bring Umbrella down. Lisa was the ultimate witness to the company's crimes, and her existence was the most damning evidence they would ever find. As the incident reached its climax, the path of the S.T.A.R.S team and the path of Lisa Trevor converged at the heart of the mansion. The investigation into the Trevor family's disappearance was finally coming to a head. Jill and Chris were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to find a way to give this poor, tortured soul the peace she had been denied for 3 decades. The final confrontation was not a battle for glory, but a mercy mission to end a cycle of horror that had lasted longer than most of the S.T.A.R.S members had been alive. Chambul, Part 26. The Final Confrontation. The final confrontation between the S.T.A.R.S operatives and Lisa Trevor took place in the deep, cavernous altar area beneath the mansion, a place that held the remains of the very secrets George Trevor died to protect. In the center of the room lay the tomb of Jessica Trevor, a stone sarcophagus that had remained undisturbed for 30 years. As Jill or Chris entered the chamber, Lisa arrived, her chains echoing through the stone hall. She was ready to defend the only thing she had left, unaware that the answer to her 30-year search was resting inside that stone box. The battle required the operatives to push the 4 heavy stones off the corners of the tomb, an act that finally revealed the truth. Inside the sarcophagus was the skull of Jessica Trevor, a small, fragile remnant of the woman Lisa had been searching for since 1967. When Lisa saw the skull, her reaction was not one of violence, but of harrowing, soul-crushing recognition. She let out a scream that was unlike anything the S.T.A.R.S team had ever heard, a sound that contained 30 years of repressed grief, pain, and longing. The monster was gone, leaving only a daughter who had finally found what she was looking for. In a moment of profound narrative weight, Lisa took her mother's skull and clutched it to the layers of skin on her chest. She had finally found her mother, but the reality of the discovery was too much for her fractured mind to bear. She did not attack the S.T.A.R.S team. She ignored them completely, her entire world collapsing into the small piece of bone in her hands. With a final, mournful cry of mother, she threw herself into the dark abyss beneath the altar, choosing to disappear into the depths of the earth with the only person she ever loved. This was Lisa Trevor's first and only moment of peace. The fight ended not with a bang, but with a tragic, quiet surrender. By finding her mother's remains, the cycle of searching and taking faces was finally broken. She had reclaimed her identity as a daughter, and in doing so, she had no more reason to exist in the world of the living. The S.T.A.R.S operatives watched in silence as she fell, realizing that they had witnessed the end of a tragedy that was far older than the mission they were on. The monster beneath the mansion had finally gone home. The emotional impact of this scene is the peak of the Resident Evil remake's storytelling. It reframes the entire game around the Trevor family, making the biological horror secondary to the human tragedy. Lisa's jump was an act of agency, a choice to end her own suffering on her own terms. She was no longer a subject of Umbrella. She was a girl who had found her mother and decided that the dark was better than the light of the lab. The final confrontation was a moment of grace in a world of madness, a temporary end to a nightmare that had lasted a lifetime. Part 27. Did Lisa ever die? The question of Lisa Trevor's ultimate fate remains one of the most debated topics in the lore of the franchise. While her jump into the abyss seemed like a definitive end, files found in the Umbrella Chronicles suggest that she survived the fall. Her body, saturated with the progenitor virus, the T virus, and the remnants of the G virus, was simply too resilient to be destroyed by a simple impact. She continued to roam the crumbling facility even as the S.T.A.R.S team fled, a silent witness to the final collapse of the Arklay research division. She was a creature that had evolved beyond the concept of death. According to the records, Lisa was only killed when the mansion's self-destruct sequence was activated. The massive explosion that leveled the Arklay estate and purged the forest of the viral infection was the only force capable of overcoming her incredible regeneration. The fire and the pressure of the blast finally consumed the biomass that had endured 30 years of chemical fire. In the official timeline, this is the moment where Lisa Trevor finally ceased to exist. Her body and her mother's remains turned to ash in the ruins of her father's masterpiece. However, given her history of surviving disposal and her status as a biological miracle, some fans and theorists speculate that she may still exist in some form. They suggest that the G virus within her could have allowed her to survive even the explosion, perhaps by burrowing deep into the earth or mutating into a form that could endure the heat. These theories hold that Lisa might still be a ghost in the charred ruins of the Arklay forest, a lingering remnant of Umbrella's first crimes. While the games have moved on, the legend of the unkillable girl continues to haunt the lore. The ambiguity of her death adds to her status as a mythic figure in the series. She is the monster that cannot be stopped, the victim that cannot be silenced. Whether she died in the fire or is still wandering the shadows, her impact on the world of Resident Evil is permanent. Her death, if it truly happened, was a mercy that the world owed her after 30 years of betrayal. If she survived, she remains the ultimate evidence of what happens when science is stripped of its humanity. She is the ghost that Spencer could never truly exorcise. Ultimately, the lore implications of her survival or death are secondary to the emotional conclusion of her story. Whether her body was destroyed or not, her spirit found its end at the tomb of her mother. The Lisa that Umbrella created was destroyed by the truth of her past. She is a closed chapter in the history of the mansion, but she remains the most significant character in the Arklay era. She was the beginning of the horror, and it was only fitting that she was there for the end of it. The fire of the explosion was the only thing large enough to act as a funeral pyre for a tragedy of this scale. Lisa Trevor stands as the most tragic figure in the history of the Resident Evil saga, a character who represents the absolute extreme of human suffering. To the Umbrella Corporation, she was never a person. She was a data point, a biological sink, and a source of revenue. To the scientists who spent decades carving into her flesh, She was a miracle of science that justified any amount of cruelty. But to the player who reads her journals and hears her cries, she is a reminder of the human cost of ambition. Her story is not about bioweapons, viruses, or global domination. It is about a stolen childhood. The horror of Lisa Trevor is not in her appearance or her strength, but in her innocence. She entered the Arklay mansion as a little girl going to a party, wearing her best clothes and holding her mother's hand. She never left that day in 1967. Her mind remained trapped in that moment of separation. Her entire adult life spent in a frantic, confused attempt to return to a world that no longer existed. She is a symbol of every victim of corporate greed, a child whose life was converted into a commodity for the sake of men who wanted to play God. Her story ends as it began, with a child crying out for a mother who can no longer answer. The tragedy is that Lisa's resilience was her greatest curse. If she had been weak, she would have died with her mother in the first week of the experiments. Because she was strong, she was condemned to 30 years of a life that was worse than death. Her survival was the engine that powered the T virus and the G virus, making her the unwilling mother of the very monsters that would eventually destroy thousands of lives. She was the heart of the nightmare, and she was its primary victim. This slow, reflective ending to her saga forces us to look past the gore and the monsters, to see the small, terrified girl beneath the biomass. Lisa Trevor is a warning about what happens when we view human beings as resources. She is the original sin of the franchise, a crime so great that it required the destruction of an entire mountain range to cover it up. As the series moves forward into a world of new threats and global conspiracies, the memory of the girl in the cabin remains the most powerful emotional anchor in the lore. In the end, Lisa Trevor found the only thing she ever truly wanted. She didn't want power, she didn't want evolution, and she didn't want to be a god. She just wanted her mother. The image of her clutching that skull as she fell into the dark is the definitive image of the Arklay incident. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated tragedy that transcends the horror genre. Lisa Trevor was finally a daughter again, and in the silence of the abyss, the chains finally stopped clanking. She was a child who was lost for 30 years, and at the very end, she was finally found.